Welcome back to History 108. In this lecture, we will focus on the 1990s, addressing the both international and domestic terrorism. So that will be the focus of this lecture. And this is something I'll talk about in a little while, but here you can see a picture of a significant event, not probably important in world politics, but significant to the United States, of a bank robbery that happened in Los Angeles back when I was in college. So I'll talk about this a little bit later. But terrorism is nothing new. It's not unique to the 1990s, but there's something in the 90s that made it stand out, particularly the rise of the internet. So we'll kind of tie a few different ideas together, but also address some of the major things that happened throughout that decade, particularly the fall of communism. All right, so the objectives for today, as I noted, right, one of them is to address the fall of communism. It's something we have to address just because it's significant. Typically, we kind of give credit to one person. The reality was that communism was falling, not so much because of the influence of external factors, but more internal. If you were alive in the 1980s, you might recall when McDonald's first went to Russia. And you see these really long lines of people wanting a Big Mac. That was something so unique over there. So, that contributed to the fall of communism. Again, an internal issue where these people wanted these foreign goods that they didn't have access to before. Number two, we'll examine the reality of the post-war period. So, yeah, communism fell, but what do you do now that it has fallen? A lot of these countries struggled to survive because shifting from one type of economy to and political system to a new one is not that easy. So it takes a while for them to make the transition. So unfortunately, a lot of bad stuff happened, which I'll address in this lecture. And number three, and we'll end with this idea, is how domestic terrorism impacted the United States. So I'll talk about a few different events, like 3 or 4 of them. And a lot of times as Americans, we always look at external factors like, somebody's going to attack us from the outside world, which has happened. We're not going to deny that. But we were so blinded by that our focus was so much on those factors rather than what was happening in-house, if you will. And these are kind of issues that still impact us today because some of these, maybe not so much the groups themselves, but definitely the ideas are there today that, there's just a lot of domestic terrorism happening in the United States. So we will begin by focusing on American foreign policy. So first I want to look at American foreign policy just in general. So the way the United States sees itself and also impacts policy around the world really from around the 1800s to the 1960s, and even to the future, right? Because I'll be addressing this, but our policies have not changed that significantly. And there's a historian named William Appleman Williams, and this book, The Tragedy of American Diplomacy, really defines almost every event we've been in regards to foreign policy. So in this book, he argues that the U.S. foreign policy consists of 3 factors, 2 that complement each other, and 1 that contradicts the other 2. These 2 are here. The first is a humanitarian impulse to help solve problems around the world, while the second, which complements this first one, is self-determination at the international level, allowing each country to establish their own goals and objectives. So basically, our goal is to help other countries, but also let them rule themselves. However, the third factor kind of undermines these 2 in regards to the way we implement foreign policy. So the last factor shows the weakness of U.S. policy. It argues that other people, other nations, cannot solve their own problems unless they follow the U.S. example of democracy. In other words, the U.S. needs to implement its ideology upon other nations. This in turn caused frictions amongst other nations that were ideologically different from the U.S., such as communist countries, or countries that were dependent on the United States. This policy only benefited the U.S. to export not only goods, import them into the United States, but also their ideology and impose it upon third world countries. However, such exportation caused a backlash that triggered revolutions because the economic policy only benefited the US, while raping the raw materials and not creating wealth within those regions. The US ignored important factors of self-determination and humanitarianism and created what was called secular colonies. And this has gone on for over 100 and something years, where the United States basically puts dictators throughout the world, right? Yes, we want to go over there and help. For a moment, we believe that they should form their own government. But at the end of the day, we feel that they're incapable of doing that, so we force our ideas upon them. And sometimes we have to support certain governments that benefit our interests rather than the people there. Guatemala is a good example of that. Was it Chile? Another one when we supported Pinochet. We had the School of the Americas. So, sometimes it contradicts itself. And this kind of gives rise to the conflicts that we have in the aftermath. The 1980s and 1990s, and obviously today. So let's examine Williams' argument about American foreign policy in different parts of the world in the 1990s. So basically what I'm going to do is implement this argument by this historian into the events that happened in the 1990s. So as the 1990s started, international conflicts seemed to shift. The Cold War came to an end in a series of steps that made the president look like a hero, even though he had very little to do with it. And here we're talking about Reagan and Bush. In May of 1989, Hungary took down their barbed wire fence that separated them from Austria, and then people crossed without consequences. When the East Germans asked the USSR what to do about the situation, they replied, quote, "We can't do anything about it," unquote. In Poland, a democratic system was put in place with the election of Domestic Polish Workers' Union, and again, the Soviets noted that, quote, "This is entirely a matter to be decided by Poland," unquote. In Germany, the scenes became much more dramatic. On November 9th, 1989, quote, "A botched news conference by an East German official triggered the destruction of the Berlin Wall when he mistakenly told the press that starting immediately, East Germans could freely leave through any of the border crossings, causing guards to open the gates," unquote. With the Soviets refusing to intervene, Germany reunified as a democratic nation within a year. This wave continued with Soviet states seeking independence, and although Gorbachev sent troops to impose economic sanctions, it did little to stop them, and it forced hardline communist insiders to orchestrate a coup, but had little ability since the military defied them. By August 24th, 1990, Gorbachev resigned, and 5 days later the Communist Party was dissolved. The US, of course, declared victory, as Bush announced that, quote, "The Soviet Union did not simply lose the Cold War, the Western democracies won," unquote, basically giving credit to himself and his predecessor. The irony was that he declared victory for a war that the US didn't know was happening, to some extent, all right? So the Cold War was happening, but what was happening within the Soviet Union was not known. Hardliners in Washington gave Reagan the credit. However, the majority, the reality was that the Soviet Union simply imploded. It is noted that, quote, "Neither the CIA nor the myriad of military intelligence agencies nor any of the experts inhabiting prestigious strategic institutes and think tanks had the slightest inkling that the Soviet system was on the verge of collapse until it disintegrated," unquote. The likely cause was the corruption from within the USSR, along with the inability to produce goods that Soviets wanted, which helped cause the fall of the Soviet factories. Since they could, quote, "churn out goods no one wanted," while stores lacked the things consumers craved, from fresh meat to refrigerators, unquote. In fact, Soviets craved Western goods, and with the introduction of things such as McDonald's and Western music and culture, such as the Moscow Music Peace Festival that took place in 1989, the Russians were in need of had an increase of Western goods. Though one would think that with communists essentially gone, the Iron Curtain finally opened, these former Soviet allies would embrace democratic processes and flourish. In fact, this caused conflict with the reunification of communities such as in Germany, where you had the Westies, the West Germans, and the Aussies, the East Germans, who, though all German, saw the world very differently. First, there were economic issues with factories closing in East Germany since they tended to be outdated. With the influx of internal migration, West Germany unemployment rose to almost 13% in 1997, while in East Germany it stood at 20% by the late 1990s. There were other cultural conflicts, particularly for East German women who were not accustomed to quote-unquote traditional gender roles, and these Aussie women expected state-provided daycare, contraceptives, and access to abortion. It was Yugoslavia where some of the most horrific conflicts arose as, quote, hate-based nationalist politics and policies would fill the ideological vacuum left by communism's collapse, unquote. Neo-Nazi movements grew in influence, and people such as the Roma became targets of discrimination and violence. In Serbia, a small, poor region in Yugoslavia, one saw the rise of Slobodan Milosevic, who wanted Yugoslavia to continue as a state since it benefited from other more important, richer regions. However, in 1981, Croatia declared its independence, and the, quote, Serb-dominated Yugoslavian army mobilized against the separatists, unquote. The Serb army engaged in a campaign of terror designed to, quote, force Muslims and Croats to abandon their homes and villages as they burned down their mosques, closed the schools, vandalized houses, and imprisoned women and girls in special camps where they were subjected to regular systematic rape, unquote. The U.S. resisted intervention until 1995 when Serbians, quote, forced 25,000 Bosnian Muslim women and children to leave the town of Srebrenica and murdered the 7,500 Muslims, men and boys, unquote. NATO, which included U.S. soldiers, intervened, but the Dayton Peace Accords did little to stop the conflict. Ethnic cleansing dominated the region as Milosevic attacked Kosovo, forcing Kosovars into exiles, with an estimate 800,000 leaving for Macedonia, Albania, or Montenegro, causing a refugee crisis and political instability. Americans received constant video of what took place through the news, and even our very own John McCain, quote, called for sending U.S. ground combat forces to Kosovo, right? This is, unquote. This is our humanitarian aspect. The U.S., however, focused on airstrikes, and after 78 days of bombing, Milosevic signed an agreement which helped consolidate his power and rid Kosovo of the Albanian population. Eventually, Milosevic, quote, became the first former head of state to be tried for war crimes and crimes against humanity when he was extradited to the custody of the UN's International War Crimes Tribunal in 2002. It's a mess over there, basically, in Eastern Germany with the collapse of the Iron Curtain. So, in Iraq, we see something a little bit different, but again, following the same philosophy of William's argument. The Iraq War has its roots in the 1980s, particularly because Ronald Reagan supported Saddam Hussein as we provided aid, military weapons, and intelligence against their conflict with Iran, along with other nations which got entangled into this conflict, with Kuwait and Saudi Arabia lending billions of dollars to support Iraq in its conflict with Iran. In fact, after his presidency, Ronald Reagan said at a speech at BYU that the U.S., quote, committed a boner, unquote, in selling arms to Iraq during its war with Iran, and now his VP had to deal with the fallout. By the late 1980s and early 90s, Americans fell in love with their gas-guzzling SUVs, and the production of oil was important to keep Americans happy. So by the early 1990s, Iraq supplied about 11% of the world's oil, while Kuwait provided 9%. So in other words, we were dependent on oil, right? This Middle Eastern region gained importance after the fall of communism and the end of the Cold War, so U.S. interests shifted. With Iraq in financial crises, it declared Kuwait, who it owed money to, as part of Iraq and planned to take Saudi Arabia. With Iraq now controlling 20% of the global oil output, the U.S. feared that it could take other regions, giving them a monopoly on oil. Using the POW doctrine as its philosophy, the U.S. would only enter the war as a, quote, last resort when the president had full support from the nation and the international community, and could win without serious loss of American life, and had a clear exit strategy, unquote. After Hussein ignored the deadline to exit Kuwait on January 15, 1981, the U.S., along with its allies, attacked Iraq. The very next day, bombing Iraqi installations in Kuwait and in major cities in Iraq for 39 days. The Iraqis deserted with about 100,000 leaving their army, all the while CNN televised nighttime broadcasts showing the awesome military prowess of the U.S. with its precise missiles striking through the night sky, destroying Iraqis' power grid, water treatment plants, radio and television stations, and roads, completely demolishing their infrastructure. By land, General Norman Schwarzkopf led a coalition force during Operation Desert Storm, defeating the Iraqi army in 4 days, pushing them out of Kuwait. The entire campaign lasted only 42 days. The Iraqis quickly accepted a ceasefire where they prohibited Saddam from, quote, rearming or acquiring nuclear weapons, established a no-fly zone, and the UN instituted an oil embargo, right? So here we see as the Iraqis began to leave Kuwait, they started burning all these oil fields and left a devastating mess, not only there, but also throughout the world, just because of the pollution that this created. The next example is Somalia. So I don't want to spend too much on all conflicts that were happening in the 90s. However, with Iraq and the Soviets no longer a threat, the US was a dominant power and felt a moral responsibility to help along with pushing our ideals amongst other nations. Again, humanitarianism has been a core value of the United States. So when the Civil War broke out in Somalia, Americans rallied for the U.S. to do something, particularly after seeing the images that emerged with starving children. The U.S. sent troops and aid to help restore order to the region. However, when an image of Somalis cheering as they dragged the corpse of an American soldier through the streets of Mogadishu, after a warlord downed a U.S. helicopter, American opinion quickly shifted. This moment was telling, particularly for one person that exposed America's Achilles heel. A new type of enemy emerged in the aftermath of these state wars, and though terrorism was, again, nothing new, it did make Americans wary of a new world order, where the enemy wasn't as clear as the Soviets. American opinion carried a lot of weight, and terrorist groups were taking notes. As addressed earlier during Iraq, the US wanted to minimize the number of American casualties because they understood that popular opinion could change during the war. Basically, if Americans saw something they didn't like, they would protest and try to get us out of that conflict, even though it might have hurt us, economically. But the one key person that's important to this story and what happened in Somalia is Osama bin Laden. The leader of Al-Qaeda was aware of this, and he, quote, concluded that terrorist attacks against the U.S. would work because Americans had no stomach for casualties. And that's the key point that I want you to walk away understanding. Bin Laden noted, quote, one American pilot was dragged in the streets of Mogadishu, and the extent of your impotence and weakness became very clear. So just seeing how just one person dying just kind of shifted the American mindset. Osama bin Laden sought to exploit that idea. So terrorism, again, we have seen it before with such as when the Pan Am flight exploded over Scotland, killing all 259 people on board. In 1993, Kuwaiti and Iraqi-born terrorists exploded a massive car bomb in the parking garage of the World Trade Center. The explosion killed 6 people and created a 6-story hole in the ground. In 1998, quote, 2 car bombs exploded outside U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, killing 225 people and injuring more than 5,000, unquote, increasing bin Laden's rhetoric to attack and kill Americans for stationing troops in Saudi Arabia and supporting Israel. Now, the enemy was no longer clear-cut, but rather individuals that function in cell operations. And it was on September 11, 2001, where 4 planes were hijacked, 2 destroying the Twin Towers at the World Trade Center, and then another one crashing at the Pentagon, and a 4th that missed its target thanks to the actions of passengers. But this really showcased the power of just a few individuals, changing the course of history. The action of these terrorists caused Americans to feel insecure. I still remember waking up that morning and watching on every channel, right, these planes going into these buildings and just the public being in shock for the next couple of weeks. It was an eerie feeling for many since the attack of this magnitude was unheard of. As Americans watched the news throughout the day of the planes crashing into the building, people jumping from the Twin Towers, people rescuing and helping others, and then the buildings collapsing, sending a wave of people and debris throughout the city. In the aftermath, the U.S. attacked Afghanistan, pushing the Taliban to the mountains and out of any political power, at least for the moment. Right, $8 trillion later, they're back. However, it was not successful in getting bin Laden until 2011, when he was killed in Pakistan. So here you see again some of the events that happened. This is the 9/11 with the building on fire and then eventually collapsing, and it just felt like we were living in a different world. We've had terrorist action before, but nothing of this magnitude. And this one event on September 11 just changes everything. And we see the power of just a few individuals bring a country, if not a whole hemisphere, to its knees. I mean, there was an economic decline. I believe my wife lost her job because of what happened here. This one event just sent shockwaves throughout not only the people, but obviously other sectors of the of our world, such as the economy. So those are some examples of, again, global issues that are happening, definitely impacting the United States, and how Williams' argument of American foreign policy kind of relates to that. Now I want to focus on domestic issues. So I'll no longer talk about Williams' piece there. But here we're talking about Americans attacking American institutions or buildings and people for the most part. So the idea of American freedom is a very potent abstract concept. For many radical fringes in American society, they believe that the federal government posed a threat to their beliefs and, quote, and the freedoms, and, quote, form private militias who armed themselves to fend off oppressive authority, unquote. Groups such as the Aryan Nation, Posse Comitatus, and others spread a mix of racist, anti-Semitic, and anti-government ideas, such as the militia of Montana, who vowed to resist enforcement of federal gun control laws. Many of their ideas weave conspiracy theories into ideas of a global takeover and the U.S. surrendering its sovereignty to the United Nations. So this is almost like right before the internet takes off. So you have these really kind of fringe groups espousing these kind of ideas, right? So using the language from the American Revolution, from Thomas Jefferson, Patrick Henry, and Thomas Paine, it helped grow their appeal of an eventual new revolution right around the corner. So again, these are things that still impact us today, right? Though not an example of domestic terrorism, the FBI and the ATF raid on the Branch Davidian compound led by David Koresh captured the imagination of Americans since it lasted weeks from February to April. The federal government charged Koresh with, quote, stockpiling illegal weapons and ammunition in their compound, unquote. As the raid took place and a fire broke out, so it's still unclear as to who started this fire, and the building went up in flames, killing 67 members, including 21 children, unquote. And again, all this was on TV. This is the age of the internet's coming into its own, television, right? News channels 24/7. So people got a lot of this. And, for some people, it was tragic. For other people, it got them all riled up. The Waco raid would have a far-reaching impact as the NRA criticized the government's actions since they saw it as government overreach, especially because there was a push for gun control in the 1990s. In addition, a, quote, spokesman for the militia movement vowed revenge, unquote. 2 years later, one of the most prominent terrorist attacks took place on April 19th, 1995, when a truck exploded outside the Alfred Murrah Federal Building in downtown Oklahoma City, killing 168 people, including 19 children, and 680 people were wounded, unquote. The blast could be felt all the way to the University of Oklahoma in Norman, 25 minutes away. In a way, it reflected the politics of the era as Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols, who had loose ties with the militia movement, quote, viewed efforts to impose a measure of gun control as part of a conspiracy by the federal government to extinguish freedom in America, unquote. Another kind of significant attack happened in the mid-90s during the Olympics. So abortion clinics also came under attack within this time frame, particularly because the quote-unquote culture wars, where Reagan's conservative followers saw the U.S., quote, in decline and felt marginalized by liberalizing cultural changes, such as sexual immorality, violent crime, pornography, and drug and alcohol abuse, unquote. So for these kind of conservatives, their America was changing, and they felt these secular changes were taking place everywhere with the support of the federal government, particularly when it came to the topic of abortion. During the 1996 Summer Olympic Games, a bomb exploded at the 21-acre Centennial Park adjacent to the Olympic Stadium, which was reserved as an open visitor zone where a man left a backpack with a pipe bomb. A security guard named Richard Jewell discovered the bag and called the local FBI, along with helping to clear the area, saving hundreds of lives. Unfortunately, in the aftermath of the incident, Jewell carried most of the suspicion. After the bomb exploded, 2 people died while 100 were left injured. The real perpetrator was Eric Rudolph, who, quote, believed that violence was necessary to stop abortion, blaming the Olympic Games as part of a celebration of global socialism, and his goal was to confound, anger, and embarrass the Washington government in the eyes of the world for its abominable sanctioning of abortion on demand, unquote. He sought national attention and continued his attacks now that the focus was on Jewell, bombing an Atlantic suburb abortion clinic in Sandy Springs. In 1997, he bombed a gay and lesbian nightclub in Midtown Atlanta. In 1998, he bombed another abortion clinic in Birmingham, Alabama, killing an off-duty policeman and critically injuring a nurse. Like the Unabomber, kind of another person, but he was around the 80s and so forth, Randolph went into the woods and survived for years, quote, on wild game, acorns, salamanders, pilfered vegetables, and discarded food, unquote. On May 2003, he was arrested behind a Save-A-Lot and later convicted to 4 consecutive life terms. This was the new America where culture warriors saw the U.S. government as the enemy and took action into their own hands, particularly because technology allowed for information to be easily accessible to develop things like pipe bombs and get access to weapons, particularly by what became known as lone wolves. And this is the point I want to get across to you, right? This idea of a lone wolf. You don't need a lot of people to cause a lot of damage. And this next thing that I'll talk about becomes a great example of that. So another event that captured the attention of the US seemed to mimic art, something out of a Hollywood movie, partly because it was broadcast live on TV and showed how individuals could be an army of one, particularly because of the immense amount of firepower one had access to. Though bank robberies were nothing new, this one really showed that individuals could create chaos and be remembered. Hence, why we're talking about them, right? And they could leave in the blaze of glory. 2 years before this robbery, the movie Heat with Robert De Niro and Al Pacino created the classic bank robbery shootout where high-powered assault rifles, it is said that the robbers of this one real event had a copy of the film, took over the streets of downtown Los Angeles. So if you've ever seen that movie, it's a really entertaining movie, but this scene kind of defines shootouts in media. Basically, it's a really good movie too. It has two great actors. The North Hollywood shootout took place in 1997 after two men robbed the bank, but were quickly surrounded by police. With only shotguns and handguns, the police were heavily outgunned since the two robbers had AK-47s with rounds and rounds of ammunition and heavy body armor. Helicopters and the local news media quickly got to the scene and captured the burst of gunfire for the world to see. The whole ordeal lasted over 40 minutes, and the two bank robbers lay dead at the end. For lack of a better word, this went viral, and people were both shocked and in awe of what took place. Even more so, it showed the carnage of what a few individuals could leave behind in a matter of minutes. And I remember I was in college watching this live on TV. It reminded me so much of the movie Heat that I had just seen like the summer before. So it was life interpreting. What do you call it? Not interpreting, but it's life becoming art, basically. So as many of you are aware, technology has forever changed our lives. Today, for many of us, our phones have become our best friends, and maybe eventually AI will become, take that role. However, in the 1990s, the internet was something so brand new that most of us did not know what to make of it. In my experience, it was mostly wealthy friends that could afford the monthly AOL fee who had access to it. But there wasn't really much to look at during those times, so most of us didn't really care. Even having a computer was a luxury for middle-class families. So just me personally, I didn't get my first computer until I was in college. And even then, it cost $2,000, and this is 1996. My Mac today costs less than that. And when I was in high school, only a few friends of mine had a computer. I think only one of them had a computer, and it was already kind of really outdated by that time. So the internet was new for the 1990s, and many believed that it would, quote unquote, revolutionize our thoughts and democratize our society. In fact, many believe that true freedom could be discovered in this new cyber world. With, quote, ownership of traditional media such as newspapers, television stations, and publishing houses becoming concentrated in the hands of a few giant media conglomerates, so think of somebody like Rupert Murdoch, the fact that anyone with a computer could post his or her ideas for worldwide circulation led netizens, so net citizens, to hail the advent of a new democratic public sphere in cyberspace. Unfortunately, it also offered cranks, conspiracy theorists, and racists an easy way to spread their views, becoming central channels of communication with an unprecedented potential for the rapid dissemination of misinformation, unquote. With this in mind, I want to look at the final example here. The last example I want to address is the age of rage, which is related to Columbine, which connects how a web of bullying, the internet, access to arms, and terror all tied together. Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold both attended Columbine High School and often faced bullying by other students. Eric used the internet to vent his, quote, anger, hate, homophobia, racism, pet peeves, and plans for the destruction of Columbine High School on his website, unquote. Though he covered many topics, Much of it dealt with death and destruction, saying things like, quote, natural selection, God damn it, it's the best thing that ever happened to the earth. Getting rid of all the stupid and weak organisms, unquote. In chat rooms, Dylan would often espouse neo-Nazi rhetoric even though he was half Jewish. What this shows is how the internet opened up a new rabbit hole for people to vent and create silos where they could meet and connect with like-minded people. In fact, as early as quote 1997, Eric was talking about collecting bombs and blowing up the school in the very cafeteria in which he and Dylan dragged two 20-pound propane tanks on April 19, 1999, unquote. The internet also gave them access to resources that would probably not been available through printed media, or at the very least, not easily accessible. The Anarchist Cookbook was, quote, once a staple of the left, but now available from numerous websites on right-wing organizations, unquote. In addition, they were well acquainted with the paramilitary hypermasculinity that taunted anyone that was deemed weak, calling them, quote, pussies, queers, and fags, unquote. This subculture saw themselves as autonomous warriors, if you will, not constrained and, quote, autonomous beings beyond the control of conventional society, unquote. They saw the world as an us versus them, where they were righteous warriors against, quote, a polluted and compromised world, unquote. So dying in the blaze of glory was viewed as virtuous, at least in their mind. Lastly, this paramilitary culture was, quote, xenophobic, racist, and anti-Semitic, unquote. So they saw themselves, quote, as defending white culture against the pollution of alien cultures, unquote. What spread in the next couple of years transformed the high school experience for a new generation. It was noted that the Columbine attack was, quote, planned over a period of at least 8 months, carrying sawed-off shotguns, Tech-9 semi-automatic handguns, a high-point 9mm carbine rifle, along with loads of ammunition, 4 knives, bombs set to detonate at 11:17 when the lunch area was most crowded. Lucky for, to some extent that the bombs didn't go off, unquote. I won't address the specifics because you can probably watch that online, right, on YouTube. However, I do want to end this lecture with a summary of the previous 50 years up to that point. As we have covered, the 1960s was a time where society became more liberated from the conformist natures of the 1950s. Social protests that advocate for the equality of African Americans and women, gays, etc., changed the fundamental understanding of previous social categories. For a few decades, the Pax Americana and economic growth seemed like it would be never-ending. As we noted in previous lessons, the 1970s saw a shift with manufacturing rapidly declining and a service economy taking over. Add to the rise of high-tech jobs that excluded the majority of the working class that were out of jobs, particularly in the 1980s, right? We see a generation of what felt to be, quote-unquote, the forgotten man. For people like Eric and Dylan, who committed this heinous crime in Columbine, and who grew up in the late 80s and early 90s, they saw their opportunities diminishing, either going to minorities, at least from their point of view, right, with affirmative action and stuff like that, or were no longer, quote, guaranteed a union job with a major corporation, unquote. In fact, the gap between the rich and the poor was growing. In addition, by the early 90s, bullying became a social problem with culture reflecting reality. For example, the song and music video Jeremy by Pearl Jam denotes this very issue, with the character killing himself in front of his classmates at the end of the video. These two wanted to avenge themselves for the bullying they constantly face, but they wanted to do it in a way that would force society to remember them. In the weeks following the Columbine shooting, quote, schools across the country experienced thousands of bomb scares, scores of attempted bombings, and several attempted copycat killings, unquote. Pulling a Columbine, quote unquote, entered our daily vernacular and became a blueprint and, unfortunately, became part of a high school experience in the post-1999 world. So, when I was in high school, the last thing we ever feared was being shot at school. And prior to this period, you don't really hear of these kind of things happening. Maybe here and there, and they tend to be very specific as to who they targeted. But obviously, since Columbine, it has become just part of students' reality. So here you see some of the pictures, right? Oklahoma bombing, what happened in Waco, the Summer Olympics bombing too. All right, so let's conclude this lecture. The first point I want to address is that, for about 40 something years, we have been fighting with the Soviets in the Cold War. And by the 1990s, the war is essentially over, right? With the collapse of Russia and also, the collapse of the Iron Curtain. So that it was significant, but at the same time, the United States had a familiar enemy for much of our lifespan for some of us, right? And all of a sudden, it just ends right there, where the focus was always with, against the Russians, and now the focus begins to shift to other parts of the world, and one of that being the Middle East. In the mid-1990s, many of my professors at the universities felt that China would be the next nemesis, right? Because they were communists. And the reality was that the conflicts moved to the Middle East, and we have seen that, right? In the late 90s into the 2000s with the Second Iraq War, going to Afghanistan, being there for 20 years. And, maybe in our current political culture right now, we see that area still a very kind of heated place. So we kind of see its roots in the 1990s. And then lastly, I wanted to stress how, yes, you might have these external enemies, or what we might call enemies, and conflicts, but there's a lot of stuff happening within the United States with domestic extremist groups rising in the last, 30, 40 years. And a lot of it has to do, thanks to technology, right? That they're able to disseminate their ideas into, through the cyber world, and reach people that probably would have never gave them a second look. And unfortunately, we see the repercussions of things like that with the different bombings that we talked about in this lecture. All right, so to give you a Works Cited page, some really great stuff here if you want to read more about some of these events that I talked about. I think this was it. The Columbine was a study of what happened there. Very deep study of the event, in case you're interested. All right, so we'll end it there, and hope you enjoyed the lecture. Have a good day.